Last Thursday afternoon, seconds after taking off from Ahmedabad airport en route to London, Air India's flight AI-171 plunged to the ground, killing 241 of 242 people on board. It's India's worst aviation disaster in over a decade. The crash happened even as Indian aviation was on a high, and it happened just 3.5 years after the Tata Group took over Air India, aiming to turn it around from a cash-strapped, badly run airline to a world-class carrier. The probe has begun, but it will be some time before any kind of clarity emerges. Meanwhile, some questions arise. What do we know about the crash so far, and what can we say with certainty? Notwithstanding who or what is responsible for the crash, what are Air India's lapses? Does India need to tweak or even overhaul its aviation regulatory body, the DGCA? Is Boeing responsible for an accident involving a plane that is 12 years old? And how capable is the AAIB to probe an accident of this complexity and proportions? We discuss all that and more in today's episode. It's Friday, the 20th of June. I'm your host, Anirban Chowdhury, and this is the Morning Brief. My colleague Forum Gandhi, one of ET's 2 aviation experts, flew from Mumbai to Ahmedabad just a few hours after the crash.
So I reached pretty late at night, at about 10:30 in the night, and one of the first few things that I saw at the airport was obviously there were too many people there from the CISF, from the Air India team, and within minutes I saw Campbell Wilson and his colleagues.
The Air India CEO. Yeah.
Yes, come down from the escalator, and I realized that things were just about to pick up pretty soon from there. So the same night I visited the crash site at about 1:30 in the night. Everything was barricaded by then. You could see that there was a very large wing kept on the side of the crash site.
The aircraft wing.
Yes. It was completely covered in dust and smoke. You could see the hostel in front of you where the plane had crashed. Most of the hostels were barricaded completely. You couldn't see the crash site pretty well from there, but it was visible that most of the buildings were covered. They were charred completely and broken. After that, I visited the hospital. And at the hospital, there were multiple buildings where different things were happening. The first place that we visited at the hospital was the post-mortem room. From the front, you couldn't see, but then we moved back. We went and we saw through a broken window that the doctors were performing the autopsy there. The bodies were completely charred. It was an unbearable sight, They were just working off that body to match the DNA. After that, we also visited the trauma center where the patients were, the injured patients were brought in from the crash site. They were still coming in, obviously, because the search operation was still not complete. But that area was completely cordoned off and you couldn't go inside, but we could see several ambulances on site. At least 10 to 15 of them were parked outside that building. And they were still coming in. All you could hear was sirens, and there was a lot of chaos, a lot of movement of doctors and policemen everywhere around you, trying to push you from one place to the other, in spite of the fact that it was almost 2:30 in the night.
For 5 days, Forum spoke to people there. officials, airline and airport executives, but primarily to those that were directly impacted, families of the crash victims, kith and kin of the crew members.
One of the most striking and the most unfortunate accounts that I came across was of a father, a 60-year-old man. He was sitting outside the post-mortem room and he was crying, but he was constantly surrounded by a lot of media people. So I offered him water first, and then we started speaking after a few minutes after he calmed down, and he told me that he was here for the DNA testing for his son and his daughter-in-law. They had come from Gatwick to surprise him, and they had decided to take him back, along with them. So Pooja, the daughter-in-law, had a miscarriage, and she'd come back to India to get some medical treatment. And here in India, the father-in-law was living alone because he lost his wife to cancer 6 years ago. They had, in this trip, told him that they were looking forward to take him along with them back to Gatwick because they didn't like the fact that he lived here alone. And the only thing he kept repeating to me is, now I am all alone. I absolutely have nothing left for me to live for. That brought me to tears at that time, and he started crying again. The other incident was of this newly married couple, Ankita and Vasant. So Ankita was joining Vasant after 6 months of their marriage. They got married on December 16th or 18th last year, and they stayed together for only 10 days. They had been engaged for a year. Vasant had come back to India last year. They met each other for a few days, and then they decided to get engaged. It was an arranged marriage setup. After their marriage, on the 26th, he flew back, and she stayed back because of the visa procedures. And finally, when her visa came, they were very elated to send her to him. On the other hand, in London, he was planning a beautiful surprise for her. He had set up the entire house. This was going to be their honeymoon as well, and this was also going to be the start of a new chapter for them. And on the day of the incident, there were at least 30 people who had gathered at her in-laws' house. They decided to give her a send-off party. She was very excited. And there were 6 cars that came to drop her at the airport, including her family as well. They said their goodbyes. She went to the aircraft. She boarded the aircraft. Within half an hour, everybody's phone started ringing. They had only stepped out like 10 kilometers outside of Ahmedabad when they turned the car around and went back to the airport. So the next thing that they knew was that Vasant was on a flight to India instead of celebrating their, new life. So these were the 2 striking incidents stories rather, that I could think of.
Forum, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
On June 12th, on that day, I was in Bombay in my office. I was in an internal meeting when I first heard the news. It was quite shocking and something that is incomprehensible that suddenly you heard. And it took me a few seconds to gather myself.
That was N. Chandrasekaran, chairman of the Tata Group. In fact, the top brass at Air India could not be more unprepared for this accident. Here's Arindam Majumder, ET's other aviation ace.
coincidentally, almost top success of the airline was not in India, while the CEO Campbell Wilson was going to Paris to attend the air show on his way on board. The second in command, Chief Commercial Officer Nipun Agarwal, was ironically in a Boeing factory in Seattle. He had gone there to get the 50th aircraft for Air India Express. And many of the top safety officials were out of India attending seminars. So they had to come back urgently, and Campbell's flight was rerouted mid-air from the skies of Dubai to get him back to the country as soon as possible. So the airline set up a operation control room rapidly. The government formed the aircraft accident investigation bureaus. They also rushed to Ahmedabad. I think for the first day, it just went to grasp what the damage was. Is there any survival? Only at late night on that day, it was very clear that there were no survival except that miraculous the passenger on 11A who
Hmm.
managed to save himself. So after that, but then immediately followed, the culture of the country is such there have been multiple VIP visits into the crash site, which I am told further delayed the process, because there are protocols when a top minister visits the crash site, which delayed the entry of even investigators into the site. So it was only meet second day after which, like, the investigator started collecting all the materials, evidence. By then, the officials of the National Transport Safety Board, the NTSB of US, were also on their way to India.
Mhm.
They also joined the investigation. The black box, the flight data recorder was found late into the second day, which was then brought to Delhi. The cockpit voice recorder was only found day before yesterday. The government finally, in its official first press communication on Saturday, said that despite the crash, ironically, like, that India's safety standards still stands. They formed a committee, and the work is still going on.
Now, the committee or the safety panel formed by India's Home Secretary that Arindam just spoke about is one of the unique responses by the government in this case. World over and in India, the AAIB or the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau is in charge of investigating all such accidents. The AAIB works independently of regulatory bodies like the DGCA and coordinates with global agencies under ICAO norms. ICAO, that's International Civil Aviation Organization, a United Nations agency that coordinates the principles and techniques of international air navigation. Now, the AAIB's scope of work is wide, from site inspection to data retrieval, for example from black boxes, to forensic analysis and issuing safety recommendations. Why then was there the need for a separate panel? Here's Arindam.
No, it's a very unique case, Anirban, because internationally, AIB is the only authority
Correct.
which has the professional capability and also competence to run such investigation. The protocol, because since aviation is governed by a very strict set of international rules, it's AIB will communicate with all aircraft
Exactly.
manufacturers or engine manufacturers, everyone. So I
Hmm.
asked the government about it, whether this is a duplication of AIB's job.
Hmm.
The minister himself told me that whether while AIB will look into this particular accident, what happened and what could have prevented it, the mandate of the committee is to have a holistic approach to how India's aviation safety plan can be further improved. So he said that the committee will give its report in three months, which is a very, very fast process in accident investigation. And
Quite improbable, perhaps, right?
yeah, if you follow global air crash investigations, none took less than a year. So
Yeah.
3 months is kind of, in layman terms, very impractical. But when the report comes out, the suggestions will be incorporated in the National Aviation Safety Plan, in the National Civil Aviation Policy, and
Hmm.
further improvements will be made.
Right, right. Is there anything else that you can share on what is the government really thinking?
The government's, like, positioning here is very, very different. You should understand that it happened under Air India, under the Tatas. Now, the privatization of Air India was a trophy project of the current government, of
Hmm.
bringing efficiencies into Indian aviation, of probably reviving a sick company. And this is a blot on India's rising aviation, shining aviation story. So, this is also a kind of watershed moment. If there have been reservations raised about the DGCA's independence or other regulators' independence, if the government wants to act, this is the moment when these shackles can be broken free and more professionalism can be brought into the regulatory bodies.
How?
As part of the 2010 crash in Air India Express, there was a suggestion that DGCA should be done away with, and there should be a civil aviation authority that comes in. What
Correct.
happens in other countries like the FAA or the CAA of Singapore, which has its own finance, which has its own authority to call the shots, and is not an attaché office of the Ministry of Civil Aviation. So there are certainly thinking on that lines, even professionalizing the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau on the lines of the NTSB, which AIB in our case is very much dependent on DGCA, both in terms of manpower and finance. NTSB is an independent organization. So those things are being talked about, and that is the mandate of the Home Secretary-led committee. How much can be done? I expect some changes. Whether that will be material or immaterial has to be seen.
Tell me about Air India. What's really happening there? I mean, apart from the obvious, do we see, I don't know, heads rolling? This was supposed to be the new Air India, which would hark back to the standards of JRD Tata. And this is just like this is just a huge undoing of that. Not that Air India was doing phenomenally well anyway. I've traveled it recently. It's really slow anyway, and it's not maybe Campbell Wilson's fault or anybody's fault. It's just the nature of the beast. But this one incident sets it back like so much. What is
Years back, yeah.
there? Yeah, what is happening?
So this is an unraveling of the new Air India story, to put it into one sentence. As of now, if whatever I get the feeling, it's a kind of zombie mode, if I can call it, in Air India. It's the realization has set in, and of course, as a professional organization, as very trained manpower, they are responding to what needs to be immediately done. The team is in a lot of team members is in Ahmedabad, helping the investigators, helping the relative. There's a control room where there is ready flow of information. But other than that, the long-term strategies or business plans all are in cold storage now. So
Correct.
as I speak, of course the insiders say there has to be an overall, and there will be a overall. I'm pretty convinced about that. And as you say, still now as a passenger, you don't see palpable result. You are just plain lucky. Monday you get a very good plane, Tuesday you get a very bad service. The consistency was yet to be brought. In such a case, when there is a glare on safety, which is the paramount in aviation, if that has to be rebooted, it's a Herculean task. The warnings were palpable. DGCA had sent notices after notices to Air India. Last year, if you remember, DGCA sent a show cause notice to Air India where there was a pilot who was not trained, but he was in the cockpit, rostered for the flight. It only came in light, luckily, when he was chatting with his captain in the dispatch, and then suddenly the captain realized that he's not qualified to fly as a first officer.
Right.
There were fines, there were penalties. People at the training head was suspended, and we should understand this part. Like, under the government ownership, the regulator overlooked a lot of things in Air India. DGCA being a government organization, treated Air India with a different ear than other private airline. And also due to the government's apathy in funding the airline, many of those things were not tackled. When the Tatas came in, they had to professionalize that. Multiple departments which never existed in the government-owned Air India, like flight standards, quality assurance, quality management, professionalizing the training. Air India ran on Excel. So a modern airline can't do that. So they brought in modern software, SAP and all. They got main power. And when it was still being done, they merged 4 airlines into 2. Merging of manuals, merging of SOPs, merging of 2 different culture. So all those things lead to their own problems. There are already groupism camps in Air India. A new set of employees coming from Vistara further widened that gap. So whether in this first reboot of getting results too early, something fundamental was overlooked that was probably being done by the government, ironically, has to be looked after. And I'm pretty convinced heads will roll, right from the CXO cabins to the departmental heads.
Got it. Tangibly, have we seen, are there any numbers to show spurt in cancellations, not just flight cancellations, but also people, canceling their own tickets because of fear, etc.?
So statistically speaking, there are no data. It still shows that Air India is enjoying an occupancy rate of above 89%, but that's only domestic. But I understand that people are opting out of flying the 787. Like immediately after the crash happened, there was a Goa London flight cancelled, and that's because even after reporting to the airport, 70 or 80% of the passengers pulled out. They cancelled the ticket, and many of these flights that you are seeing as cancellation and Anirban, those are probably not due to technical snags but also due to very low occupancy. And as travel agents have told us, and those are again anecdotal evidence, they have seen groups cancelling in large numbers, even corporate clients cancelling and opting for another airline. So there is a commercial repercussion that the airline is facing. It's very natural after such a huge catastrophe.
Do you foresee conclusive findings? I mean, at least the main cause of the crash in the preliminary AAIB report that will come out in a month, or do you think it'll take much longer? Let's not forget AAIB is working under limitation. It has its own understaffing problems. It is no NTSB, etc. So,
the first challenge is the flight data recorder. As I understand, it has been heavily damaged. It's not, it has been damaged by the impact, it's been damaged by the post crash fire. So, hence, it is not being, the country doesn't have any capability to extract data. It is being sent to NTSB's lab in Washington. Depending on the quantum of damage that the flight data recorder has sustained, the data extraction, I was told by an investigator, could take from 48 hours to months' time. So if the damage is kind of very, very severe, there will be a long time that before in any preliminary investigation can conclusively throw some evidence. But I expect that some clarity will be reached within the first 2 or 3 months, if not in the preliminary report, but at least in the first 60 days in today's era. Not many modern eras air crash have been found without a result. Investigations have always yielded results, except in some few cases. Like in this case, I believe that the data from flight data recorders and other will be sufficient to reach to a conclusive evidence.
now there have been several theories explaining the crash, from twin engine failure to human neglect to fuel contamination. Amit Singh is an aviation safety and flight ops veteran of 35 years. In the past, he's held leadership roles in AirAsia and Indigo, is a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, the founder of a non-profit called Safety Matters Foundation, and an author. I asked Amit to plot the accident for me.
So we have to plot it backwards. So we know where the accident happened. And then we know that after getting airborne, the aircraft crashed down in 32 seconds. So you calculate that in 32 seconds with a particular speed, how much distance will the aircraft travel?
Right.
Then you plot from backwards from where the aircraft first crashed, right? So if you plot backwards toward the runway, then you'll get the airborne point, which is close towards the end of the runway. So that is one of the way you can confirm that this aircraft getting airborne was delayed. Now, why was it delayed? Could be because of either an engine failure or there was some issue with the loading weight of the aircraft. The second fact is that the landing gear was down. Now, was it left down inadvertently, which means something happened just before takeoff that the crew got distracted? And we have seen it in training number of times when the crew suddenly gets distracted because of a bird hit or an engine failure. So there's a tendency to forget the gear down. Or there could be a failure in the landing gear system or any other system which leads to the landing gear technically inoperable. Then we have an airborne phase and the aircraft starts coming down. So why does the aircraft not sustain flight and continue the climb gradient? So if both engines are operating, you forget that landing gear down, no problem. There's enough thrust, so there won't be any change.
Right.
Now, if one engine is affected, which means you're operating at 50% thrust and you leave the landing gear down or it doesn't retract, then landing gear is a big surface. It causes a lot of drag. the remaining engine may not be developing sufficient thrust to counter this imbalance. So here the two theories are: one engine fail, landing gear down, and you are overweight. The second is the second engine is also affected. It could shut down because of the same reason as the first engine, or inadvertently the flight crew switches off the engine, which has happened in the past. So it could be anything.
Right.
But the net effect is the second engine also starts producing less power or no power. So that is how the aircraft will come down.
Now, the aircraft crashed into the BJ Medical College in Ahmedabad, killing several students there. Both engines were thrust deep into the walls of the building. Amit said one of the engines wasn't visible, the other one was. He told me that the titanium casing on its fan blades are intact, that there is no visible dent on the casing on one engine, according to Amit, means that this engine failed. There's of course been no official confirmation yet. Now, one theory widely being shared in the news and aviation circles is that the aircraft used emergency power generators in the final seconds before the crash. That typically points to a serious failure in the aircraft's main electrical systems. In the Dreamliner, this includes the deployment of the Ram Air Turbine or RAT, a wind-powered device that generates electricity and hydraulic pressure to maintain control of the aircraft in the event of a total power or engine failure. So, was the RAT actually deployed? Here's what Amit said.
The only way to prove that two-engine theory is because if the two engines fail, the rat should come out. And if they don't see the rat, which means both engines have not failed. So they are trying to look for that rat.
Okay.
And in the blur, they see something which is sticking out. No, it's not connected to the aircraft. They can't see, but there is some kind of a blur. It could be anything. And they have gone further with the audio. And now when the aircraft passes by, the engine noise is recorded. So that they're saying, no, that is the noise of the propeller, the rat. So this is confirmation bias. So just because they have to go with the theory of double engine failure, that confirmation bias, they're trying to show the rat also and make you hear the noise of the rat, a propeller like sound.
Now, what about the possibility of human error? Here's Amit.
When we talk about human error, the pilot is the last line of defense. And most of the cases, a pilot is not alive to tell the truth or stand by the truth. So that pilot error is a wrong terminology. It is human factor. So every pilot who's flying has been trained and checked, is proficient, competent to fly an aircraft. But why do these pilots who have been checked again and again every 6 months meet with an accident? Because the environment changes, the combination changes. So what nobody is looking at is, were both the pilots in control of the aircraft? What if there is a pilot incapacitation? Nobody's considering that. If the co-pilot is inexperienced and the pilot suddenly collapses during a critical phase, that inexperienced pilot will forget to take the gear up, and further he may or may not take some actions which leads to an accident.
Amit, how do you read the DGCA's comment that there are no major safety concerns with Air India's 787 fleet?
No, DGCA should not have commented actually, because in this accident, DGCA itself will be investigated. So DGCA could be one of the contributory causes for their inaction or anything like that. That because DGCA did not act on the airworthiness and the maintenance went down despite knowing and despite serving them show cause so many times, and they imposed fine on the airlines, but they did not curb their operation or stop their operation, which meant that they were lenient towards them. But the culture didn't change. Air India continued like that. This is an example. So this is how DGCA will be as a contributory cause that they could have prevented.
Got it. Understood. Now, the AIB, the Nodal Investigating Agency, is also said to have its own limitations, some of which were pointed out by Arindam. Here's Amit.
AIB does not have the manpower, trained manpower to conduct an investigation of this scale. They have people who were with DGCA basically, except for the head of AIB, who's an ex-Air Force officer.
Right.
All others have come from DGCA and they will be loyal to their original organization. They still hold DGCA email IDs. This office is attached to the ministry, so they claim to be independent, but their appointments, promotions, everything is dependent on the ministries.
Amit, what about state of the art equipment, processes, etc.?
Equipment also they won't have, because here whatever they recover from the wreckage, all those metal parts or composite parts have to be analyzed. So they cannot analyze the composite parts because that metallurgy and other things, microscope, so that they have to determine what part broke and which one did not break, why did it break. So they have to look at the structure, aircraft structure, and analyze that. They have to look at human factors. There's no human factors expert. They have a list of consultants who are paid per session, but in the past, I haven't seen a good quality report being produced by AIB. Again, here we have another committee, high power committee, who surprisingly has more powers than AIB, because all the data has to be the possession of AIB, and as per the act, it cannot be given to anybody. But in the order for that high power committee, it says that this committee will have access to cockpit voice recorder, which is the most protected evidence, and FDR and everything. And within 3 months, they will give a report, which includes the root cause. That is what is written in the order. I don't know if they will find out the root cause or not, because there is no technically qualified person on that committee.
Amit, tell me about the Boeing angle here, or rather, issues with Boeing aircraft in general that have been doing the rounds after the crash.
That can also be the contributory cause if it comes out that one of the reasons was the design kind of exemption given by FAA or a design defect.
But Amit, this is a 12-year-old aircraft, right? In the sense, Air India has had it for 12 years.
Yeah, so I'll give you two examples. So the two examples are one, Boeing 757, which was introduced in the 1990s. So when the aircraft came in, one of the US airlines, they were given a simulator also. So the trainers were kind of playing around in the simulator, trying emergencies, giving emergencies and other things. So they came across one failure in which there's a flight control issue and the aircraft goes into an uncontrollable state. So they were quite surprised at how come we were not told about it, that the aircraft can go out of control in this particular failure. So they sent a query to Boeing that while analyzing the faults in the simulator, we came up with this one fault in which the aircraft goes out of control. So Boeing said, yeah, relax. This kind of a fault will almost never be seen on actual flight. So you don't need to even practice this. So that particular airline took out this particular fault and they said, we don't need to practice because Boeing has said. And soon after, it happened twice. So that particular fault came, but because of the presence of mind of the pilots, they survived. Similarly, on the 787, there is a exemption which has been given on one of the systems for the engines, that in a particular scenario of crosswind and certain other things, the engine can suddenly go into a full thrust, uncommanded thrust, without the knowledge of the pilots. So Boeing asked for an exemption on this thing, saying that it is not likely to happen, 1 in 10 million hours. So FAA said, okay, you put all these 4 or 5 precautions, and then they said 1 in 10 millions is a safe bet. So in the interest of public safety, we can issue this exemption. But is DGC aware of this exemption, and are they okay with this exemption? Do we want to take a risk, or can they decide for our risk? Because ultimately, our regulation says any new aircraft which comes in, we will evaluate it individually, independently, then decide whether it is safe or not. But since we don't have the capability, or we haven't built our capability in so many years, despite new aircrafts coming in, the 320 came, then the 787 and the 350 now. but we still haven't developed our capability, even though we plan to build a civilian aircraft. So it is incumbent on DGCA to independently analyze and evaluate the risk based on the Indian context. And in 2019, on a 787, both engines have failed on a Japan Airlines aircraft. Luckily, after landing, just as they landed, both engines failed. So these remote possibilities, like the 757 or the 787, if it is 1 in a million, then it could happen at some stage. So are we prepared for that?
That is among many questions India and Air India will have to answer in the coming months. The stakes are painfully high. It's a test of India's aviation oversight, its investigative machinery, and its commitment to public accountability. As the AIB sifts through data and wreckage, families wait, experts speculate, and thousands of flyers demand clarity. These are public responsibilities, and how swiftly and effectively India rises to shoulder them will decide how its aviation industry is perceived by the world in the coming years. That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by me and Vinay Joshi, sound designed by Amrit Reggie. A new episode of The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Be safe, have a good weekend.